You mind hitting that start button for me? Welcome to Road Students. Oh, we got that clip right. Oh, well. Welcome to Road Students Podcast. My name is Elijah, and I've got with me Zach with us. And we're going to talk about last night. We talked about loneliness, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about loneliness.
Yeah.
You feeling pretty lonely?
Kind of.
Oh.
What's that song? I'm so lonely. You know, like Mr.
This is why
Lonely.
he is helping us teach and not sing. But go ahead, man. What did we talk about?
Loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
So we did this loneliness, and then kind of just when hard times hit in life, and you just throw your hands up, and you're like, man, I don't know what's going on. Kind of like just like I don't know what's happening. We looked at the story of Job, and I started out reading Job 1, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, which talk about basically who Job was and the possessions he had, and his family, just describing what was going on in Job's life at the beginning of the story. And I told the kids, like, man, like this guy by the world standards had it all. He had possessions. He had a healthy family. He was respected, and he even describes him as like being a man of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was a good dude.
Yeah, he was the priest for his family, right?
Yeah.
Like he went to God, though his family didn't really follow God, he still prayed to God and offered sacrifice for
on behalf of them.
Yeah.
Right. And then I was like, okay, so like we look at that and we see this truth about Job's life, and I said, like, well, how does he have anything to do with loneliness or hard times if he has all these things? And so then I read a little later in Job 3:11, where Job basically says, hey, I wish I was never even born. So I told him, I was like, man, how does this guy who had it all by the world standards, who was a good guy, look up and say, man, I wish I was never even born? And the truth I told him was like, no matter how strong and independent you are, or how much you think you have your life together, like life will find the breaking point in you. Everybody will have a breaking point at some point in life, because life gets hard. Some people have harder lives than others, and that is reality. There are sometimes we look up and we say, I don't know what's going on. And so I told them, I was like, well, how can we go about this when hard times hit, when lonely times hit, and honor Christ in this, right? Because it's not that lonely times aren't going to come, it's that they will come. So how do we honor God with that? And what truths can we draw from Job? And the first point that I told them we need to realize is the longer loneliness and difficult times last, the harder it can become to trust God. And we saw that in Job's life, was because at the beginning, at the end of chapter 1, after Satan had caused all these hard things to happen to him, right? He lost all his possessions. He lost his family. He got sick with boils, and his wife even looked at him and said, hey, you might as well just curse God and die. He ends with chapter 1, and he said, man, like, naked I came into this world, and naked will I leave it. Blessed be God. Everybody blesses God's name. Like, he gives and he takes away. He said, man, God has every right to take away from me because he's blessed me with so much, and so I'll still praise his name. That's the first thing we see. But as the time goes on, and his sickness still remains, and he still is poor, and his family is still like no longer in existence because they passed away. As time passes, he a little later on, he looks up and he says this in chapter 13. He says, how many of my iniquities, my sins, he's talking to God here. He says, make me know my transgressions and my sin. Why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy? And he's talking to God here. So his whole perspective has changed, right? So now I told the kids, his focus is more on his circumstances versus being on God. His focus has shifted. And I told him that's super dangerous, because when our focus shifts from God to our circumstances, we begin to blame God instead of seeking refuge and guidance from him, right? And I told him, like, when this happens, guys, when we shift our focus, when we start getting more and more frustrated with God and start blaming him more for stuff that really he has nothing to do with, we begin to distance ourselves from him. Because, right, we're no longer seeking God to know him in an infinite way. We're too busy blaming him for our circumstances. And that's what Job has started to do. He's kind of looking at God and saying, man, why have you done this to me? What have I done to deserve this? Right, almost like declaring his own self-righteousness. And when we begin to blame God more than we can blame him instead of seeking him, our focus shifts and we begin to distance ourselves from God. When that happens, we allow Satan to speak into our life, right? Because we're no longer seeking God, right? So God's no longer number one in our life, and Satan begins to get a little finger in there to throw the door of our life wide open. I told him he'll start saying things like, did God really say you're loved? Or do you really have any value? Or, man, you should just really just forget God because your life would be better without him.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously you're following God, but all these hard things are happening. So obviously God really doesn't care about you, and Satan will start whispering these lies to us. And it just, when I told the kids was when we're making this lesson, I'm making this lesson, is like Satan, you don't see him mention him ever again, right? It doesn't mean his influence wasn't there, right? So he caused all these bad things to happen to Job, but doesn't mean he just stopped, right? Because his whole goal is to make Job look up and say, basically curse God, right? Mm-hmm. And so I told him, I think we're going to the next point was we see Satan's influence through some of Job's friends. What I told him was like, the friends that you have, right? You can have all the friends in the world, but you can still feel alone. Mm-hmm. And you look in Job chapter 3, his three of his friends look at him and say, hey, the reason all this stuff is happening to you is because you sinned against God. Basically, like, all this bad stuff is because of this sin that you've done. So you need to repent to God. And if you can go talk about that, that's a completely different topic about how that's not the correct way to view it. Mm-hmm. I truly think
it was all works-based type faith for them.
Yeah, right.
He had a fourth friend though.
He had a fourth friend. I don't know how do you say it.
I don't know.
It's the E. It starts with an E.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really talk much about him. I could have, for the sake of time, I didn't. But what I told him was like, just as these friends had influence in Job's life and kind of almost drove him deeper into the state of loneliness, because that's what you see. Like between chapter 1, we talked about Job's first response to God, and chapter 13, we see his friends speaking to him. And I really think that was Satan driving him deeper and deeper into a state of loneliness and feeling lost, to where he eventually said, God, what have I done? Mm-hmm. Make known to me what I've done wrong to you. Where he starts to question God. And so I told him, who do you have speaking into your life? Right? It's important for us to have godly people and God speaking into our lives in general. When hard times hit and life just gets hard sometimes and you feel alone, that's even more important to have godly people speaking in your lives, because they'll point you back to God. But if you have Satan influencing you and you have people who are not godly people influences speaking in your lives, and you're just going to go deeper and deeper in that state of loneliness and hard times, because you're going to start sitting in your circumstances and blaming God and not asking him for help, which is the third point that I told him about Job's life, which was pain and loneliness. The greatest strength comes when we sit in our circumstances. I think that's what Satan wants. He doesn't want us to ask God for help. Doesn't want us to seek him. He wants us just to sit in our circumstances and blame God. And this point kind of came from when I thought about the story of Job. It was like, man, like Job never went and got help for his medical condition, right? We don't see anywhere where he sought out a doctor or whatever, a physician. I don't know if that was the name at the time for the guy who would help him with that. I told him, like, maybe you're not struggling with boils like Job was doing, but think about internally what's going on with you. Are you just content with sitting in your loneliness, content with sitting in your depression, content in sitting in a broken relationship? Are you just content with sitting there because you're just going to get more and more miserable as you let time go and as you just sit in your circumstance? Or are you going to bring it to God? And I think oftentimes when things get hard, we are more quick to sit in our circumstances versus going and saying, God, help me, right? And asking for his help. And so something I told them when I struggle with loneliness, because loneliness has been a struggle in my life, just feeling a sense of feeling alone throughout my life. Some of it's my fault because I have different paths that I've gone through. I told him the verse that I really cling to was Psalms 18, which says, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." And so I told him, God was like, man, like, we see that God provides and that he is there for you. And then I told him, I was like, man, maybe you're sitting here tonight and you're saying, Zach, like, you don't understand, like, what I'm going through. You don't understand the loss that I've felt. You don't understand the broken relationships that I have going on in my family. You don't understand the anger and violence that's going on at home. And I was like, yeah, that stuff might be happening, okay? And I understand that's the reality of life. And I can't fix that, because that's just the reality of living in the broken world. But I told him, like, but we forget often who was writing this psalm. And it was David. I told him, I was like, David's writing this psalm. And when you know anything about David, his life was far from anything perfect or free of conflict or free of hard times or free of feeling alone, right? David, right, just sleeps with a woman, has her husband killed. So then there's a curse brought on his family, like for his generations, and his own son even rapes his daughter, right? And eventually he's driven off his own throne by his son. and he's driven out of his empire, and it's thrown in. It's like David's life is crazy, but he writes this psalm, and it's like he's not writing it because life is easy. He's writing it because he realizes that life is hard, and because life is hard, he needs a stronghold. He needs a place of refuge, and he realizes that was God, right? And so as I told him, I was like, it doesn't mean life is going to be easy. It doesn't mean life is not going to have times of loneliness and hard times where you just don't know what's going on. But the reality is that when those times come, you can run to God, and he is a stronghold and refuge that will get you through those hard times. And that's led to our last point, which was that God restores, and he restores with more. And when I told him, I was like, that's in the story of Job, you see that he ultimately remained faithful to God. When the dust settled, he was still faithful in following God. And he received, it says he received 2 times what he had, and he ended up having more kids in the family. And when I told him, I was like, I don't want you to think I'm saying that you're going to get a bunch of money in your bank account or the nicest house if you just stay true to God through all of this, because sometimes you deal with a hard time, you deal with a situation or a circumstance for the entirety of your life. You might struggle with loneliness, you might struggle with depression your whole life. And that's kind of a sad reality when we think about it. But I told him, I was like, but why I say God provides with more is because at the end of it, when you faithfully walk with God, when you cling to him through it all, let him be your stronghold, he will get you through it on this side of reality. And then when we die and we go to heaven, that's where the greater reward is, which is heaven, and walking free from loneliness, free from suffering, free from hard times, free of all this stuff. And that's what we set our eyes on. Don't be so caught up in the present circumstance, but be looking to the future reward. And that's what gets us through the hard times of life and the lonely times of life. And I kind of tell them my story with the struggle of it and how the story of Job kind of shifted my perspective, because the Lord eventually answers Job and he says, where were you when I did all these things? Like basically, where were you when I made the world? Where were you when I tamed these mighty beasts? Right? Who are you to contend with the Almighty? Almost. He's like, kind of calls Job to the carpet. And God did the same thing in my life when I was questioning him in a time of loneliness of why he left me, why he'd forsaken me, and I felt like he'd done that. And then God, through this, basically revealed to me, he's like, why, Zach? Like, why have I done this? Like, I haven't done this. The reality is you've just been too busy blaming me and pointing your finger at me to realize that I've always been there wanting to be with you and wanting to get you through it. But your bitterness and your circumstances have made you just look up and say, this is all your fault, God, when the reality is, this isn't my fault at all, right? I'm promising to get you through it. And it's kind of like, where were you when this is what I told the kids, like, where were you when I made the very earth you walk on? Where were you when I put my son on the cross to die for your sins? Where were you when I quite literally made you in your mother's womb and gave you the air that you breathe? He's like, see, Zach, I've always been here. But if you're too busy pointing your fingers, if you're too busy sitting in your circumstances, if you're too busy letting your focus be about what's going wrong in life versus what God can promises to get you through, then you're always just going to sit there. But we have to cling to God through it all, through the hard times, through the lonely times, and know that something better is coming in the form of heaven. So that's the lesson we had last night.
Awesome. Well, good job, man. Proud of you. And we'll see you guys next week.
Yep. Deuces. What are we talking about next week? Oh, next week we're gonna bring in a counselor to talk about. It's kind of a deep serious topic of suicide and how we deal with these thoughts that we have and how we need to realize the value that we all have from God, that because He's created us and He gives us a value.